Well, welcome everyone to our session this morning. I'm Lyn Torres from Monash University Library, and I'm here with some colleagues that were at Monash at the time from the Faculty of Medicine, Nursing and Health Sciences. I've got Loretta Garvey over here, and over here in this corner we've got Georgina Willits. So we're going to present today two case studies actually on how we've used the RSD to map skills in the curriculum. And we used in vivo qualitative data analysis software to do that mapping. And our first case study, or the first case study that I'm presenting, is research that I did for a Master of Education degree, where I looked at first year biology students in the practical experience, and I had a look at what skills they were developing in the prac, and I used the RSD for that. This case study too was in the Master of Nursing Practice, and I've got to say that my research did inform what we did in the mapping of the skills in the Master of Nursing Practice, but we tweaked a few things, changed a few things. It was quite an experiential approach, and it did take quite some time to do, but we learned a lot in the process. And we used an element of the RSD to map the curriculum there, and that was Bloom's taxonomy. So in brief, some of the, say the conclusions or some of the things that we did find. Case study 1, there was a mismatch between the instructional autonomy in the lab handbook and what the students actually experienced in the lab, and a few other things which I'll explain when I get to that part. Case study to do with the Master of Nursing Practice, there was a mismatch between the educational language, professional language of the standards, the curriculum, the standards of nursing practice. So case study 1, that was identifying students' research skills in Bio 1022. So as I mentioned, it was a Master of Education, a qualitative study, and my guiding question was, with reference to the RSD, which research skills and associated levels of autonomy are students developing whilst undertaking practicals in Bio 1022? So just a little bit of background. My interest in this topic is because I'm a librarian, and my job is to take my area of expertise, which is research skills, out into the faculty and embed those skills in the curriculum. And I lead teams of librarians at Monash Uni, and I also work with learning skills advisors, and I also have a colleague who's here as well, Barbara Hasbeck, and we have complementary roles where that's what we're tasked to do. And it's always been very difficult to get our skills into the sciences, and I think it's got something to do with the way that we conceptualise research skills as something that a researcher does, or that science academics in particular conceptualise it as something that a researcher does, and not necessarily something that an undergraduate student might be developing as part of their undergraduate learning. So with that in mind, I looked at a first year, second semester practical unit, and the unit had 6 pracs, but I only observed 5 because the 6th prac was a presentation, and I wasn't able to look at what students had done to prepare for that presentation, which were experimental processes. 3 of the pracs were recipe-driven traditional science pracs, and 2 were IOL-inspired pracs that went over 2 sessions. So it was the one topic explored over 2 sessions. The same 8 students were observed in the pracs across all of the 5 sessions, and I also did an interpretive analysis of the lab handbook, actually a documentary analysis of the lab handbook and a prior interpretive analysis to both the descriptive observations and to the lab handbook for my data, and I coded the skills that I observed in alignment with the RSD framework. So that's just an example here of how I broke down the facets of research in vivo. So this box here on the left, I broke down the RSD into facets and also into students' levels of autonomy. And as I was looking at the descriptive observations and the content in the handbook, I'd have a look at, well, what skill does this chunk of information belong to? And I would map it to one of the facets and then consider the level of autonomy that was embedded in that instruction, and also map it to one of the levels in the RSD. As I was doing that, sub-skills were emerging in the data, and I was able to create a skill statement that was related to the facets that I was observing from the data sources. And that's this table over here. And I know it's difficult to read, but I was able to just break down what each one of those facets look like for the practical experience. I also referred to the biology threshold learning outcomes to guide my thinking, and particularly around the terminology, because science is not my area, so it was a whole area that I just was totally unfamiliar with, so I had to find the language myself. And using the threshold learning outcomes helped me find that language. I did find that the threshold learning outcomes had to be kind of broken apart a bit to map to the RSD, which also gave me an idea of how skills can often be categorised into clumps, and we can't often see what's actually happening in those skills. But the only thing that we have to guide us to develop students' skills are things like these learning outcome statements, but sometimes it's difficult to see what's actually taking place. So just the first bit of data that I had a look at was the learning aims. So from the lab handbook, I mapped the learning aims to the RSD, aligned them with whether it was about scientific content, scientific concepts, scientific technical skills, or the facets of the RSD. So the first three columns represent the 5 pracs for scientific methods. So having a look there, you can see that scientific methods are quite evident in the learning outcomes. Same with scientific concepts and technical skills, but the skills of the RSD, or research skills, are poorly represented in the learning outcomes. And that actually aligns with the literature that says that the emphasis in the practical experience is developing students' practical skills and not necessarily research skills. And it was also interesting because of the fact that 2 of these pracs were inquiry-orientated learning practicals, but they still also failed to express research skills as an outcome of that learning experience. So these 2 tables here, the one on the left, is from analysing the lab handbook. So each one of those columns or each one of those boxes represents each prac, and this table on this side, or this graph on this side, is the analysis of the student observations in the prac itself. So the first table here tells us that the lab handbook was highly prescribed, but there were also areas there where skills were expressed in a quite an autonomous way, but there was no alignment there with the development of those skills. And you can see in the second, in prac 2, there's a little blue dot at the top of one of the second column, and that is an open research instruction where students were instructed to do their own research using anything except for their textbook, without any prior guidance as to how they could find the resources that they needed or any guidance as to how to go about researching. It was just do your own research. That was the instruction. Then we've got on this side the practical experience, and that's an entirely different look. So there's still a very highly prescribed approach in the prac, which is expected because they were mainly practicals that were, highly guided and traditional. But what's interesting is that these last 2 ones here are the inquiry-orientated learning pracs, and they were also incredibly highly prescribed, and more prescribed than the recipe-driven practicals. Now, there were 2 teaching associates that delivered these pracs. 1 to 3 was delivered by an experienced teaching associate who prompted students all the time through the prac with questions and very sophisticated questioning technique. And in doing that, she was actually able to take students from, in a very prescribed teaching approach, to a higher level of autonomy. But students in the IOL-inspired pracs were taught by a TA with very limited teaching experience and poor vocabulary to describe research skills. So these students actually remained in a very highly prescribed teaching environment with very little opportunity to move into higher levels of autonomy. So it was quite interesting to see that even though I was out I set out to find out what research skills students were developing, I found that yes, those research skills are there in the practical experience, but it's really up to the teaching associate in that environment to use the language that enables students to learn the skills. So I might just leave that there. I've summarised that, and sorry, I'll hand it over to nursing.
It's lucky I talk fast, don't worry. So case study 2 was looking at the Masters of Nursing practice, where Georgina and I both work in. One of the reasons we were looking at this area was that we had a new curriculum coming along in our bachelor program, and we wanted to have a look at using a pedagogical evidence-based approach to designing curriculum and looking to see how a framework can underpin that as well. And so far it hadn't been achieved in nursing. So one of the things that was a bit of a problem for us was that although we wanted to have an evidence-based approach, we also had an alignment where we needed to meet the requirements of the professional body as well, and seeing how we could do those two things side by side and carry out and create a good nursing program was not yet, we couldn't find any evidence that that had previously been achieved. So we got started and we wanted to use the MELT frameworks, but the big issue was which one of the frameworks to use. So in 2015, so quite a few years ago, we engaged with our very talented colleagues at the library, and it was without them this process wouldn't have been possible. And when we started having a look at those frameworks, we realised through the workshop that we undertook with the librarians was that all three of the frameworks were really relevant, and we couldn't use one in isolation. One of the areas, for example, when we were doing the mapping process, we had a learning outcome that required 2 facets of the WSD and 1 facet of the RSD because it was looking at advanced assessment skills, and not one in isolation was able to capture that. So what we did was that we decided that we needed to go back to basics, because trying to map a curriculum using 3 separate frameworks at once was far too complicated, and no one else was probably going to use it again, and it wasn't a clear evidence-based approach having to scatter across those different frameworks. So we went all the way back to the beginnings of where the frameworks began and back to Bloom's. So what we did was that we looked at the professional standards of practice of nursing and also our curriculum separately. And we triangulated the results. So one of the things that we did find by doing this, that there was actually a misalignment between the professional standards represented in Bloom's and our curriculum, which was a little bit of a problem for us because we'd created that to meet those standards at the end of our degree. So we did this in 3 phases, and again we were using NVivo, and it was very much from the process that Lyn had done in the biology course that we were able to approach this. So we mapped our Masters of Nursing curriculum to the professional standards. Then we mapped the curriculum to the pedagogical frameworks, so using Bloom's. And then we looked at the pedagogical frameworks to our professional standards. So that was a 3-phase approach, which we've completed now. This is our standards against Bloom's taxonomy. And what we did was we broke down the Bloom's into the affective, the cognitive, and the psychomotor. And you'll see that all of them are represented here, but to different degrees. But all of them were required in order to map our full professional standards. The cognitive alone didn't cover a lot of aspects that we do in nursing. And here's a snapshot of just the affective, and we can see the different levels going up as the complexity raises in the affective domain. We have more of a representation of that in our nursing standards, which we would expect because that is a nurse who's currently registered and practicing. But then this was the more interesting one for us. The light blue here is our professional standards and the dark blue is our curricula. And there was a mismatch between those two things. So these are them mapped each against the Bloom's taxonomy. And you'll see here that these are very high, and in other areas these are high and these are low. So we had a mismatch between what was required of the professional standards and what we were doing in the curricula. So this mismatch that we decided maybe was not entirely related to the curricula that we were outputting, but it was actually a mismatch between the language. So reasonably so, the language in our professional standards was not educational language. The language in our curriculum was, because that's what we do every day. So what we did is that now through the mapping of Bloom's taxonomy to each one, we've developed shared understandings of what the professional standards mean in terms of educational language. And so we're developing awareness and a systematic process to do that. And the next step for us is to be overlaying our MELT frameworks over our nursing curricula. And this will mean that we will have our professional standards being underpinned by curricula, which is underpinned by our pedagogical frameworks. And the outcomes from our case 1 is...
just to consider the RSD for the training TAs in particular.
So I think it came from the area that you were looking at in terms of the mismatchonomy of the biology. So the very experienced TA who maybe had a more prescriptive area, and the one who had a more inquiry-based, who was made it more prescriptive. So seeing how that mismatch we could work on their professional development there. And that is it. Thank you.